But here's the next question. What are some things to be aware of / general tips about getting into a relationship with someone who has an avoidant attachment style?
Okay, so I think in order for me to answer this question, I first have to explain what an avoidant attachment style is.
That would help, yeah.
And I will use this as an opportunity to say, and I hope Sean will put the link on this when we post the VOD on YouTube, but I have a video about attachment theory if you want a more in-depth understanding of how attachment theory works that you can find on my YouTube channel. In a nutshell, the way that avoidant attachment works in adulthood is that a person has learned that their needs are not going to be met consistently and reliably by people they perceive to be caregivers. In this case, the person you're in a relationship with. And so what they do is they become very self-sufficient, and they will detach from a relationship to meet their own needs when adversity strikes, rather than perceiving the people or person they're with as reliable enough to confide in. So they will tend to vibrate with extra anxiety when there is a need for closeness in a relationship, and they will default to autonomy whenever adversity strikes, because the most consistent and reliable person that they've been able to engage with through their lives is themselves. So if you get into a relationship with somebody who exhibits an avoidant attachment style, what that means is that you need to be very careful not to overly pursue that person and personalize their distance or need for distance when certain adversity strikes in the relationship. Let's say they have a death let's say you're 2 months into the relationship and somebody in their family dies, and they confide in family members and friends, or they kind of isolate themselves instead of talking to you about it. If you take that personally, you're going to be in trouble, because you have probably not built up enough consistency and reliableness in that relationship for that person to perceive you as somebody that they can turn to in a time of adversity. And what I often see early on in relationships with this is a person will over-personalize that person's need for distance and think it's something that they're doing wrong, or that they're not good enough, or whatever it may be. And that's, if that person has an avoidant attachment style, that's not true. It just means that you have not had enough time under your belt to devote to creating consistent and reliable responses that that person can then look at and say, okay, I can rely on this person. And so what that means at the outset is that when that person advocates for some distance and autonomy, you validate that need and allow for it. It's okay for you to say, hey, I'm starting to feel really detached from you, and I would appreciate it if we could engage a little bit more when you're ready. Like, that's okay. You can assert your needs to connect, because pure autonomy just doesn't facilitate a relationship. But respect for that person's need to focus on and rely on themselves when adversity strikes, and patience with that, is going to go a very long way. So that would be my advice for a person who's getting into the initial stages of a person who's avoidant.
But Dr. Mick, how long is too long for me to put up with that dynamic?
Whenever you decide it's been too long. There is no quantifiable measure for this. So that, I love that question, and I think you know that I love that question, because one of the questions that we get all the time is we want quantifiable metrics for these things, and there are not. Okay, like, it's not, if this goes on for 3 months, 2 days, and 4 hours, then bail. It doesn't work that way. Again, it's another way that humans want to have concrete ideas for things that are not concrete. If you reach a point where you are getting tired of it, you can, if you trust and want to build that relationship, you name it. You say, hey, you know what? I really appreciate that you need your space when shit goes down, but I also need to feel connected to you. And that is starting to wear on my ability to hang in there with this relationship. And so I really want to work together to figure out how to close that gap sometimes. I want to respect your need for autonomy, but I also need to feel connected to you. And truthfully, that person wants to feel connected to you too. It's just, that's not their default. If that relationship can't be sustained, then get out. Because now at that point, like, that person's not willing to work with you on it. But if you decide it's too much and that you've had enough, that's good enough. You can leave at that point. It's not As I've said, any reason is a good enough reason to end a relationship if you decide you want to end the relationship.
But Dr. Mick, someone in their family died and they didn't use me as a source of support. That seems kind of big, doesn't it?
Yeah, so you should totally bring that up with that person and be curious about why that was the case. Curiosity over judgment is going to go a long way, to quote Ted Lasso to an extent, because he has a really great quote about that. But curiosity over judgment is going to go a long way. So I'm curious why you turned to your friends instead of me when your grandmother died. And don't ask that. Oh, here's another tidbit for me. Do not ever ask a question if you are not prepared to hear the answer. That is for me, it's one of the few universal truths in a relationship. Do not ask a curiosity-based question unless you are ready for the answer. Because if a person gives you a truthful answer and you freak out at them, you have punished them for telling the truth. It's okay for you to have an emotional response to their answer, but you should never, ever punish somebody for answering a tough question honestly. Because if you asked it, you showed and signaled to that person you were ready for the answer. If you freak out or you punish a person for answering truthfully, they're going to learn not to answer your questions when you ask them or to avoid you. They're not going to just go, oh, well, I get that it's okay for them to validate how upsetting their answer is, but don't ever ask a question you're not ready for the answer to in a relationship, ever.
All right. Somebody
that is
asked
particularly
that
true post-affairs, by the way.
Oh, yes. That's yes. Very good point. But in this example, someone asked you that question, and that person's response is, because I don't consider you family yet.
That person has to make a determination of what that means for them. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell somebody that should or shouldn't mean something. If you believe deep down in your heart with the amount of time that you've invested in that relationship that you should be conceptualized as family at that point, and that person has just explicitly told you that you aren't, then you have to make a determination of what you want to do with that information. And that is for you to decide whether it's important or not.
Nice. That was a great answer. I'll give you props for all those answers. That was solid.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else you want to?
I'm going to go ahead and put a stream marker in there on that.
Oh, no. I'm not going to curse because it's going on YouTube. All right, I'm going to go to the next question because I know that you will talk about attachment theory for literally the rest of this.
Yes, I could do it forever. Lecture on YouTube if you want that.
We don't want that. Here's the next one. Wait, did it go in there? Oh, wait, no, it didn't go up there. Hold on. Why is it going up? I'm going to refresh. Give me 1 second here. A little technical difficulty.
You're good. Also open up. Oh, is it just straight up frozen?
Kind of.
Because I don't see anything in the queue. Oh, there we go. Yep, got it.
I know it's different for everyone, but how does someone go about moving on from a relationship? It seems that after however many years with the person, your life in a way becomes that person and life seems harder after losing them.
Okay, so there's a piece of language within that question that I have to pull out and examine. Your life can very highly prioritize a person, but should not become the person. That language, whether it was intentionally stated or not that way to indicate that, I think is very important, because if you overly invest into another person to a point of losing your own sense of autonomy, that is unhealthy. And the healthiest relationships have a lovely moving balance of connectedness and autonomy. So when people divest their autonomy, or they transfer their autonomy into another person that they're in an engagement with, that is inherently going to create anxiety throughout the relationship, because other people are moving targets and they have their own needs and agendas and stuff. So like, that's always going to, your sense of self is going to be a moving target. So that in and of itself is an unhealthy dynamic. But it's okay to acknowledge how deeply important a person was in your life, particularly if you were with them for an extended period of time. I mean, hell, I've worked with folks who divorced after 30 some odd years together. And that is it's a very powerful experience for a person to have, because you do begin to, you think about your future and everything you're doing relative to that person generally. Like anything I do throughout my day, my wife is in the periphery of me thinking about what I'm doing. And that's a natural part of a relationship. But there is a grief process that goes along with moving on from a relationship. And I think we get too much external pressure from people to just rebound and find somebody else and move on. And one of the most adaptive ways that I've ever heard people talk about the ending of a relationship, particularly if it was like a one-sided ending, is that they essentially conceptualize it as if the person and or the relationship died, and that you almost grieve it that way. And in some ways, it's not grieving the relationship itself, it's grieving the idea of the relationship that you had. And so I do think that when people attend to the reality of a relationship, that can sometimes help move you through that grief process a lot easier, because you're playing the cards you have. It's the people that get stuck in the idealization of what the relationship could have been, what they hoped it was going to be, that often have a harder time moving on from a relationship, because they get stuck in thinking to some extent passively that that's what the relationship was. And it wasn't. The relationship was whatever it was that ended. And I will say this, and this is very hard for people to hear sometimes in the advent of a breakup and even years later. If somebody breaks up with you, they did you a favor. It's hard to hear. But that person has said to you, I can no longer reciprocate the investment in this relationship that it needs. And they have told you that they need to move on, and they are giving you the opportunity to move on as well. Because you do not deserve to be in a relationship that you are invested in and that person is not invested in it. It is way worse for people when a person checks out of a relationship and then continues to stay in it and sabotage it because they don't have the strength, or they don't believe they have the strength to end it, than it is if a person ends it. And it's devastating. It hurts. It's one of the most painful things that a human can experience. Okay, which is why there's grief that goes along with it. And there's a whole attachment perspective on that I'm not going to go into. But like, it's a grief process that is unique to you. You move through it how you need to. Don't let anybody else tell you how you're supposed to grieve it. You do what's right for you, as long as you're not harming yourself and other people. And remember that that person, even though they did something that was painful, they did something good for your relationship by acknowledging that they could no longer invest in it in the way that it deserved. It's hard,
Dr.
man.
Mick, it was really painful for me and the breakup, but it seems like they moved on immediately. What the hell is up with that?
Because they've thought about it for a hell of a lot longer than you have. People very rarely spontaneously break up, especially if they've been invested in a relationship for a long time, or unless there's like a very specific blow up instance that's like straight up deal breaker and I'm done. But if it is something that seems to come out of nowhere for a person, it means really two things. And I'm going to try to say this as not harshly as I can, because some people are good at hiding it. But it might mean that you weren't paying enough attention to the relationship and the reality of it. Or maybe we're actively ignoring it. And maybe that person was really good at hiding it. Okay, but there is a chance that maybe you weren't seeing certain signals that were happening and weren't paying enough attention because, again, you were into the ideal of what it is as opposed to the reality of it. Or because you moved into a space of this is unconditional and it's going to last forever no matter what, which is not a healthy space to be in. But they have likely thought about it for a long period of time. So they have been actively grieving the relationship in whatever way they need to while you're still around. And then when they end the relationship, and if you're feeling blindsided by it, now you have to do all the work that they've already done up until that point. And that can be very painful. But this is the thing, and I'm gonna make this point here because I feel like it slides in nicely, is when somebody breaks up with you, that is permission for you to create whatever boundaries you need to create. You no longer owe that person anything. That person has said, I no longer consent to being in this relationship and I'm not in it anymore, which means that you no longer have to consider them when you are creating boundaries. Now, if you have children with that person, it's a little bit different. You damn well better be considering your children and thinking about how to be a good co-parent. But as far as the relationship itself, you are entitled to whatever boundaries you want to create. If you want to block that person on everything and not correspond with them because they broke up with you, that is your right. They don't get to reinvest with you or re-engage with you just because they're the ones that broke up with you. So if a person breaks up with you and then gets mad at you for blocking them, that's their problem, not yours. You didn't do anything wrong. If that person was breaking up with you to send a message that they actually wanted to figure out a way to work together, they sent the wrong message. You should never use a breakup as a means to send a message. You can certainly say that I'm thinking about breaking up if we don't attend to this, but never use a breakup as a vehicle for figuring stuff out. It doesn't work. But that's really why that happens, is because that person's had more time to think about it because they're the ones that took control of it and ended it. And you didn't have that opportunity.
I'm actually going to flip it. And I'm going to say, Dr. Mick, I moved on really fast after my last breakup. Does that make me a bad person?
Nope. Sure doesn't. That's an easy one. No. If there is anything that anybody takes away from this Q&A, I really hope it's this. People overly attend to the shoulds that other people push onto them with their relationships and their conceptualization of it, as opposed to paying attention to their own experience. The idea that you should be broken up over it and that you should be just devastated by a breakup is representation in society and whoever the hell else you want to throw into that bucket telling you that you should be devastated by it. If you're not, you're not. I see this more with grief of like death of a family member, right? Like people who like their father dies and they're like, I didn't really feel anything because my dad was a dick. Am I a bad person? It's like, no, your dad didn't facilitate enough of a relationship with you for you to feel terrible when he died. It's the same thing with a relationship. It may be that when a person breaks up with you and you have a little bit of space from it, you realize it wasn't healthy for you either. And that you actually could do better for yourself. And that can be a very relieving thing. So your relationship and your breakup is your relationship and your breakup. It's okay to accept certain influence from folks who you trust. It's okay to talk to a therapist and hear their perspective on it. But ultimately, you should never really let anybody tell you how you should feel about anything. That's not anybody's place. Because no matter how you... There's no such thing as what you should feel. The only thing that exists is how you do feel. Anytime somebody asks me, how should I feel about this? I always say, how do you feel about it? Because that's what matters. That's what we're working with. I don't give a shit what you should feel. And nor should you.
Huh. I'm thinking about how like this question would get shaped, like if I had somebody in the room. So like if I don't care about how I should feel, how do I get to a place of where I want to feel?
That's going to happen through the way that you frame what's happening and through the actions you take as a result of that frame while you feel what you currently feel. So if you want to get to a point where you feel satisfied or joyful or whatever it is in your life, that is only going to happen through action and through work on your end of how you conceptualize what's going on. That's why I offer the reframe, right? When a person breaks up with you, they've done you a favor. A lot of people look at it as that person screwed me over. That person threw away our entire life. Just because a person breaks up with you doesn't mean it null and voids all the good things that happened in the relationship. You can still appreciate a relationship for what it was, even if it doesn't last forever. So I think sometimes people get into that too, where they think like, okay, well, this just voids everything. No, it doesn't. If you took a trip to Florida that was like the greatest weekend of your life, that still exists even if the person broke up with you now. You don't have to take that out of your memories. So, but the way that you're going to move toward how you want to feel is going to take work. And a lot of people don't like to hear that. A lot of people think it's just going to happen. No, it's not. You're going to have to do some active work on how you process this and then what decisions you make going forward that are healthy for you and in your best interest.
Okay, I'm just going to throw this question up here because I think it fits really well in what we're talking about. And it's, what are healthy ways to deal with anger from past relationships that didn't sour?
Acknowledge the anger. It's okay to be angry. So, what's really interesting is whenever anger comes up, people always think that anger is something that needs to go away and be dealt with. That's not totally true. The problems with anger are often the behaviors that people choose when they're angry. It's not the anger itself. It's why we call it anger management, not anger go away. Okay, and what we're really talking about is your behaviors. So you don't have to deal with the anger. You can be angry. It's fine. If you had explicit rules about fidelity in your relationship and that person violated those rules in the form of an affair, you can be mad about it in perpetuity if you want to be. You can be angry about it. Now, what behaviors you choose as a result of that is important. Okay, so you can't be going over to that person's house and spray painting their garage door. You can't be blackmailing that person. Don't be going talking shit about that person to their employer behind their back. That kind of stuff is the stuff that causes problems. It may feel good to do that, but you're not really doing anything other than just being shitty, like doing shitty things. So you acknowledge the anger for what it is. You validate the fact that what that person did made you angry, and that's okay. And then you also become mindful of the ways in which you perpetuate the anger in your mind. Because there are some times where folks will fixate on what the person did that made them angry and will just keep running it on replay over and over and over and over and over. And then you can elicit emotional responses from yourself by how you run tape in your mind. And so people will just keep ruminating on something that happened, and then it perpetuates the anger. And a fun little fact that nobody ever talks about, and that I've had to present many times throughout my career, is that, oddly enough, that anger, sometimes we try to keep it around because we feel connected to the person when we feel it. And it can actually be really hard to detach ourselves from that anger because it means we're actually moving on from that relationship. And if you don't want to move on from that relationship, you'll maintain the anger. So I think it's important to understand if that's happening as well. Is anger a way you're trying to maintain connection with that person abstractly in your mind? Because if it is, maybe we need to move that energy elsewhere. Into the relationships that are good and are supporting you and aren't doing things that are making you angry. I also think it's important in this to understand this, that what happened in a previous relationship does not in any way predict what will happen in a future relationship with somebody else. And a lot of us, our brain is wired to take our previous experiences and then make assumptions about similar processes going forward. And you have to be very careful about that, because if you were, let's say you were cheated on in a previous marriage or relationship, that doesn't mean the next person you're with is going to cheat on you. And if you expect that that's going to happen because of that past experience, you're probably going to start acting in a way that is not conducive to connecting, and you're going to perhaps push that person away, and it can sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So be mindful of the way that anger fuels your expectations going forward, and change those expectations to something that's more healthy for you and for the person or people that you engage with going forward.
Bit of a callback for you here. Dr. Mick, my current partner talks about their past partner and our relationship a lot. Is that a red flag?
If you say it is, sure.
Okay, you got that one. Well done, yes.
I will say this, though, because this is something that comes up often, which I know is why you're asking it. You are not entitled to anything leading up to the point in time where you met that person and engaged with them in a relationship, particularly if it's defined as an intimate relationship. You are not entitled to any of that being different. And what I mean by that is you will have people who get into a relationship. I see this most often with sexual partners, Person gets into a relationship and they're like, oh, my partner slept with 20 people before I were in this relationship and I slept with 3. And they will get really activated by that. You have to accept the past of a person if you're going to engage in a present relationship and a future relationship with them. Now, you can hold them accountable to do better going forward, okay? So like, but even what I say this even is like, let's say a person in high school said something homophobic. And if they said that now, you would be like, no fucking way am I ever going to be in a relationship with this person, right? Like, no, I can't be in a relationship with somebody who said something homophobic. They said something homophobic 20 years ago. You can decide that that's a good enough reason to not engage with this person in the present. But if they're current, like they've learned a lot, they've progressed, they've become a lot more accepting, they've done the work, you have to accept that that was something. If you choose to engage in a relationship with that person for who they are now, you have to accept that that was something that they did in the past, that that was something they said. You have to accept however many sexual partners they had. You have to accept whether they were married. You have to accept whether they have a kid. You have to accept all these things. You have to accept that they got suspended from high school for 3 weeks. Like, all of these things have to be accepted in that. But then you can hold people accountable now and going forward. Okay? So I think sometimes people feel entitled to a different past, and you're not. You just aren't. And you should never ask questions about that you don't want answers to. And also, I generally recommend that people not be forthcoming about past relationships unless the other person engages them from a point of curiosity about it. But I also think it's not something that should be off the table completely. I think it's okay early on in a relationship to focus on the budding relationship that's happening now. But it's okay to talk about previous relationships later on if you define that as okay in your relationship. But whatever boundaries y'all want to have around that, you need to agree upon. I'll share a little mini personal story. I just learned a story. I've been married to my wife for 2 years. We've been together for 8. I just learned a story about one of her ex-boyfriends last week. And it was probably the only point in time where I was able to hear it and like appreciate it for what it was. So you don't have to dump all this stuff out on the table, but also these things change as a relationship progresses. That what we talked about is no longer threatening to me. It never should have been, but it's no longer like emotionally threatening to me in a way that it might have been early on in the relationship. So I share that because therapists deal with these things too.
Oh yeah. Actually, I think this was a really good question that was asked kind of in time because it relates to it, so I wanted to throw it up. If you were cheated on in a previous relationship, would it be healthy to identify and discuss with your current partner, or should that be a topic avoided with the current relationship?
I think it is okay to disclose. But there is a very specific way you have to disclose it. You have to disclose it in a way that you take ownership for how that has affected what you're bringing to the relationship, rather than using it as a, here's what I'm going to assume about you because this happened to me. Okay? So I think it's okay to disclose how it impacted you. If there are tender spots, if there are things that maybe are going to create a more of an emotional reaction than maybe that person might expect because of that prior experience, but you are consistently holding the previous partner accountable for the cheating, not the current partner. It is not your current partner's job to resolve whatever loose ends you have from that previous relationship. Now, that relationship, by virtue of being healthy, can resolve those things, but it's not their job. Okay, so it's not, I've been cheated on, so you better watch out, and you better give me full access to your phone because I damn well am not going to be cheated on again. That is an unhealthy way to approach that. The healthy way to approach it is to say, hey, I want to give you a heads up. In my previous relationship, I was cheated on. It hurt a lot. I am working through processing that. I have more of an understanding of how it's affected me. And I just want you to know that if I get particularly emotional at something, I'm going to take responsibility for that. And I want to work together to kind of have a reparative moment with us because I'm not assuming that you're going to do what my previous partner did. And I would appreciate your patience on that. That's a healthy way to approach that.
Do you think it's okay not to disclose?
I do, but if you start noticing that there are behaviors that are showing up in the relationship and assumptions that are showing up in your relationship that are the direct result of that, I think it's time to talk about it. If you have done the work and you can enter that relationship without that previous experience affecting what's currently going on, then no, I don't think you have to disclose it. But if it does start to affect your behavior in the here and now and affect the current relationship, I do believe that that person has a right to know where that's coming from, particularly if it's not because of them that it's happening.
Dr. Mick, I didn't disclose that I cheated in my previous relationship, but my partner found out that I did, and now they're mad. Do they have a right to be mad?
Well, they can be mad, but they don't have a right to take that out on you, because that is what happened in a previous relationship. Now that person could maybe express some worry, right? Like, I think that's fair. I hate the saying once a cheater, always a cheater, by the way. That's an absolutely insane statement. I really recommend people never use it or live their lives by it. But it's okay to be angry or even disappointed, but that falls into what we were just talking about. That is part of that person's past that did not happen after the point in time in which you chose to engage with them as a relationship. So it's your job to work through your anger as it relates to that, and to make damn sure you do not take that anger out on that person, because that is very unfair to do.
But Dr. Mick, we said we would be honest with each other, and now they think I'm dishonest because I didn't share this with them.
Did you ask?
No.
Okay. Then there's no reason why it needed to be said. If you asked have you ever cheated on somebody, and they said no, and then you find out, they lied to you. That's an event that happened post engagement, right? So now it's about but it's not about the cheating. It's about the lie. You can't make it about the cheating. You have to make it about the lie. And that's a very important distinction. And that's why, friends, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to say, this is why when there are issues that happen in your relationship, talking to a therapist can be immensely helpful, because I can guide that direction. I can say, nope, we got to focus on the lie, because that's the thing that affects this relationship. The fact that you cheated in a previous relationship is inconsequential to this relationship. It's the fact that you lied.
Yeah, no, I think recommending therapy in that situation is extremely helpful, because I think with that specific example that I just made up on the fly, and I'm thinking about the interaction more, it would be really, really easy to go down a path of somebody saying, like, if you were to say, I think you're more upset about the lie than you are about the cheating, or I think the lie is probably the thing that we should focus on instead of the cheating, it's very easy for that person to counter and say, you're just deflecting and you don't want to talk about the cheating. But a therapist is a good third party to be like, well, hold on. Let's stay here for a second. Let's figure this out first, and then we can come back to that.
Absolutely.
So,
because there is an argument to be made. There is an argument to be made that if that person was to say, well, if I knew that this person had engaged in infidelity at the start of the relationship, I would not have engaged in it. And that's perfectly fair. But again, it still comes down to the lie, because that person cheating prior to the relationship doesn't really get to be the point of emphasis right now, because of the fact that there was a lie there. Because if you didn't ask and you didn't have the information, that's an entirely different scenario than if you asked and they lied to you.
Yeah, I like it. Anything else you want to add to that one?
No, it's a good one though.
Cool. What are warning signs for codependent relationships?
Oh boy. Okay. Codependency is one of the most misunderstood concepts I ever see amongst lay people. So I have to explain a little bit about how codependency actually works. Codependency is when both people are reliant on each other in a way that perpetuates itself. It is not when one person is reliant on another person. A lot of times people think that, like, if I only get my emotional needs met from my partner, that I'm codependent. No, you are not. You are codependent if you both constantly are only engaging with each other for emotional needs and are perpetuating that and can't detach yourselves from it. That's when you're codependent. Another example of codependency might be like I earn all of the money in the relationship, and I am the one that manages it. Like, that is a form of codependency that I see sometimes around finances, right? Like, I bring it in, I'm dependent on you to manage it. I manage it, I'm dependent on you to bring it in. That's codependency. It's not, I rely on this person for their income. So it's both people are contributing. Codependency is not always bad. I think that's another thing, is like codependency gets a bad rap. A lot of times people think that it means you're overly clingy, or that it's a harmful thing for the relationship. It's not. I mean, in the example I just gave you, one person earns the money, the other person manages it. That's a perfectly healthy dynamic that I see all the time. So the signs, a warning sign for an unhealthy codependent relationship would be, if I become upset about something that has nothing to do with my relationship, and the other person in my relationship also becomes super upset in a way that kind of hijacks my own upsetness for the thing that's outside of our relationship, that's a warning sign. Because what you see sometimes with people with emotional codependency is that they can't differentiate their own emotional experience from the emotional experience of the other person. And when you get so melded like that you can't identify your own experience, and you're consistently looking to another person to tell you how you feel about something, that's often a sign of codependency. So those would be the primary warning signs.
I don't know. I almost want you to talk more about codependency not being a bad thing, because I don't, like, in all the times I hear the word codependent out in the world, I don't think it's ever framed in anything but like the worst light possible for a relationship.
I'm going to have to give you an example from an attachment perspective. I would, because that's where my brain just immediately goes. I would argue that a couple forming a secure attachment to each other is a form of healthy codependence, because there's a understood reliance on that other person for consistency and reliability in the advent of adversity. Like, I know that I can rely on my partner, and my partner knows that they can rely on me when shit hits the fan. I know that we can work together as a team when our in-laws or when our family is being a pain in the ass. I know that when we're under some sort of societal pressure, that I can bond together with my partner, and that we will be with each other, and we understand each other really well. I would actually make an argument that within the LGBTQIA community, that there is healthy codependency, in part because there has to be for survivability purposes. So when we start talking about the dynamics of a couple relative to societal strain and marginalization, I think that's also where we start to see like healthy codependency. I know that we can rely on each other to be stable for each other and point out when our environment is a threat. And my emotional experience of being threatened is something that's shared with this other person, and threatening that person is also threatening me, can be healthy. So this is part of why I really dislike when we talk about codependency as an always harmful thing, because there are plenty of people that survive off of codependency because they have nobody else to depend on. So I think of two folks who've gotten thrown out of their families because of their sexual orientation, and they find each other, and they have a very healthy, stable relationship that allows them to explore their environment more effectively because they have a reliable attachment base. That's healthy codependency. You're really going to tell me that that person needs to fully diversify into a harmful system? No. So that would be another example. I think that would be the most salient example of codependency I can think of that's actually healthy.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a really, really good way of saying it. Like, I mean, kind of in like this is no slight to the person who asked the question, but kind of like inherent in this question by asking what are the warning signs for a codependent relationship, it's already very clear that there's a negative bias towards a codependent relationship. So I think it's really interesting to always hear a perspective about how codependency isn't always bad. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but like I think even within circles of some therapists, like codependency is treated as like a bad word.
100%. Oh yeah.
Because it's just kind of how we've been programmed to see it.
Yeah.
So it's always really interesting to hear it not be that.
Yeah. I will say that if you want a warning sign of bad codependency, the best example I can give as I'm thinking about this and talking about it is if you lose a sense of your own autonomy and who you are to a relationship. That is the warning sign. When you can't think of who you are separate from that person to a point that like you're potentially degrading other outside relationships and engagements, that's a sign of codependency that is unhealthy. And that has to be operating for both people involved for it to be considered codependency.
Mm-hmm. Very important point. All right, I'm going to do the next one.
Do it.
What are
good stuff
healthy
tonight.
ways? Yeah, this is very solid. What are healthy ways to handle disagreements instead of shouting at each other?
So, fun fact, there's a reason biologically that humans shout at each other when they fight. And it's because they perceive themselves as not being heard. So, the natural process when we perceive ourselves as not being heard is to think, I'm just not being loud enough. And I'm not being forceful enough. It's why when people try to talk to folks who don't speak their language, they get louder when they speak because they don't feel heard when they're saying what they're saying. So, the thing about it, though, is that shouting never works. It does show engagement. It does show that people care. Okay, so there's passion there. But it never works because your brain perceives shouting as threatening. So what it'll do is it will start to put you into a anxiety response in the form oftentimes of either fight or flight or freeze. And so now you're in a very emotional, like reptilian brain space where when your prefrontal cortex goes offline, you literally cannot hear what a person is saying to you. You cannot synthesize that information into meaning. So now you just have two people being loud, and it might as well be gibberish. So, healthy ways to handle disagreements really comes in the form of warm, controlled conversation that is filled with validation. It is okay for some emotional intensity to show up in a conversation that's in fact healthy, but any emotional intensity needs to be met with a reliable and consistent, warm, validating response. And if you are not in a position to hear what another person has to say, you need to say that. You need to say, I'm not currently in a position to hear you and I need to step away for a few minutes. However, if you are the person who steps away from an engagement, you have to come back. You do not get to move away from the relationship and expect the other person to reconnect it. If you need to walk away, you have to come back. And you should indicate that you will be back to that person before you leave. But it's to speak from I statements. It's to spend more time listening than focusing on what you're going to say next. It's to approach with curiosity versus judgment and assumption. When we get really heated and we start yelling at each other, it's often because we're making a bunch of assumptions. And if you could pause and ask a person who's yelling at somebody else what's going on for them, they really could give two shits what that other person is saying. They care more about what they are saying. And if you're in a position where you only care about what you're saying and not what you're hearing, you're not bringing a good faith effort to an engagement. So a therapist can help de-escalate that. We've got certain strategies that people can use, but your goal is to be as measured and warm as possible and trusting that your relationship can sustain a difficult conversation. Because the thing is, sometimes people think that they can only have hard conversations by yelling, and that's not true. You can talk about very difficult things and, maybe cry, or perhaps just freeze up a little bit or lose your words. Because the other thing is, when people are vulnerable, they often perceive themselves as losing power, and so yelling is an overcompensation for that loss of power. So they will exert power by yelling because it's aggressive, and we think it's going to cause people to stand down. So being aware of that dynamic as well is super important. That, like, vulnerability is not a loss of power. Vulnerability is actually a position of strength, and it's one that can be harnessed really usefully if both people are able to access that. And I do have a video on YouTube it's called Vulnerability Cycles, where we talk a little bit more about why people yell as a survival strategy for vulnerability.
You touched on it a little bit, but I do want to press you for maybe like one or two answers. But let's say I found myself in the middle of a shouting match and I realized I don't want to do this anymore. How do I de-escalate?
I would generally argue you should leave the environment. So, like, going into another room, I think, can be really useful. I think saying, if you have the insight to think, I don't want to do this anymore and I can't hear what you're saying and engage properly, that also means you have the ability to say it out loud. And so I think it's okay to say to a person, hey, this is beyond where I want to be. I need to take a break, and I will come back when I'm ready to engage with you. And if you're the recipient of that language, do not chase that person, because all you're doing is throwing gas on a fire. If that person has the wherewithal to walk away from it, and they don't come back, that's a problem. And I 100% of the time am going to look at a couple if somebody does that and say, yeah, you fucked up. When you left and then didn't come back, not good. You can't do that. So I do think that leaving the situation can be helpful. Oftentimes, just because you decide you want to de-escalate doesn't mean the other person decides they want to de-escalate. So you can't expect the other person to de-escalate just because you're trying to. And so you need to do what you need to do. And removing yourself oftentimes, I think, is the best way to do it. And to cool off, take a few breaths. Takes anywhere from 20 seconds to 2 minutes to get your prefrontal cortex online after it goes offline. And it takes about 30 minutes to get all of the hormones flushed out of your blood that go off when you're yelling. So if you can, at the very least, give it 2 minutes, but even better, maybe give it a half hour, you're going to come back in a lot better space than you were a half hour prior. There's two things that happen when you yell and when you get into that kind of disagreement. There's your nervous system, and then there's your endocrine system. Your nervous system acts super fast. You go into a sympathetic nervous response, which basically turns off all unvital organs and gets you into a fight or flight, ready to run space. It's a survival mechanism. But what that also does is it shuts off your ability to hear and synthesize information. Your pupils dilate. You are in pure survival mode. Your parasympathetic nervous system is what needs to be re-engaged in order for that to calm down, and that brings all of your other systems online. And that does in some ways require some like controlled breathing and stuff, but it does happen naturally because it's not sustainable to be on a sympathetic nervous system fire for a long period of time, which is why I say it's about 2 minutes at the max. But then you also secrete a bunch of hormones through your system, through your endocrine system. And because those are through your bloodstream and not through your nervous system, it takes a longer period of time to flush cortisol and all that stuff out of your system through your kidneys. So you might be shaky for a little while because you have hormones that are going through your blood. So we need your parasympathetic nervous system back online to where you're more stabilized and in a period of nervous homeostasis. And then we need your endocrine system to get the hormones to get flushed out of your blood for you to get back to a neutral zone. And that takes time. If anybody's interested in more about this, Mona Fishbane has some really interesting work about the brain science of relationships and conflict that I encourage people to read.
How do you spell that?
MonaFishbein. I think it's called like Loving with the Brain in Mind is one of her most popular books. She came and did a couple guest seminars when I was in grad school, and it was fantastic. Because the thing is, a lot of times when people understand the biology of an argument, it can really bring the defenses down. because we're all slaves to our biology. So if you know what's going on biologically in a given engagement, it depersonalizes it for people.
Yeah,
I'm gonna type it in chat as well for anybody who wants to see how it's spelled.
You answered all of my follow-up questions that I was going to ask you. So, well done there, but knowing what I was going to ask before I asked it.
Cool.
I am jumping to this next one. As an asexual person, I often find myself struggling with finding myself in relationships with people who want the sexual aspect.
Mm-hmm.
How do I manage my own desires versus actually ending up with someone?
I'm not sure I understand the second half of that question. How do I manage my own desires versus actually ending up with somebody?
I'm also not sure if I understand it.
I'm not quite sure I understand that, but I will try to answer the first part of it, because this is something that folks who are asexual struggle with, because the overwhelming majority of humans are sexual.
Mm-hmm.
So sex does not have to be present in a relationship to have a meaningful relationship, but also it's okay for sex to be important. And I think it can be very difficult for an asexual person to couple with somebody who is sexual, particularly if the person who is asexual is not willing to allow the person who is sexual to find that either in the relationship in some way that that person can agree with, or outside of the relationship itself. I think one of the problems we have with the overemphasis on monogamy is that it really hurts people in the asexual community, because they will often internalize the need for monogamous sex in a relationship. And one of the best antidotes to an asexual sexual relationship is to allow the person who is sexual to engage sexually outside of the relationship with rules that are jointly agreed upon in the dyadic relationship. So that's certainly a possibility. If that is something that is off the table for the asexual person, then I think there has to be a level of acceptance that perhaps a fellow asexual person is who you're going to need to couple with. Because in the same way it's okay to take sex completely off the table in a relationship, it's okay to leave sex on the table and to have that be something that's important to a person. And so, I mean, we're essentially talking about the same kind of mechanisms that go along with being in a relationship where there's different spiritual views and stuff like that. Like, you're going to have to do some really complex problem solving around that, because the thing about sex is that it requires joint consent. And to say, I'm not interested in sex in this relationship, but you're also not allowed to pursue sex elsewhere at all, is just as damaging as a person saying to an asexual person, you have to have sex in order for this relationship to work. It's an impasse that is one that requires a huge degree of respect and problem solving around, and that can be difficult. And unfortunately, because the pool is disproportionate in a massive way towards folks who are sexual, asexual people feel the sting of that a lot more, because it's way easier for sexual people to avoid asexual people than it is for asexual people to avoid sexual people.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing I just want to say in general, because I really don't think this gets brought up enough. We do a fucked up job of normalizing asexuality in our society.
Totally agree.
And it is one of the things that I kind of, as I've gotten older and met more people and also just been more involved in therapy, probably makes me my most sad. Mm-hmm. Because I also agree, there is nothing wrong with prioritizing sex, but there is something wrong with judging a person that does not want sex.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And we just, because of the way that our society is built, it is just such the norm for us to look at someone who is asexual and think that there is something wrong with them. and you'll hear shit like, "Oh, it's just not. It just hasn't happened for you yet. You just haven't gotten there. You just haven't met the right person." And it's just like, no. If you find yourself to be an asexual person, you are an asexual person, and there's something that it's okay. Like, that's fine. And it really, really makes me sad how often we mistreat people in the asexual
outright dismiss them. I mean,
Yeah.
like, just we just assume everybody wants sex, but also being asexual doesn't always mean that sex is totally off the table. Like, that's the other thing, is like, we tend to go into this space where it's like, if you're asexual, it means no sex of any kind in any whatsoever way. You're just strapped with a chastity belt and you're never gonna do anything, and that's not true. There are asexual folks, if you're in a relationship with a person who does desire sex, who might be willing to do certain sexual things with that person because they know that it matters to them and it's something they could perfectly consent to. Like, it's not a super black and white thing. In the same way that people who are sexual can go months to years without having sex. Like, it's not by choice or otherwise. So it's not like you're just incapable of having sex, but it does mean that, like, if you don't desire it and you don't want to have it, that's fine. It just, the ramifications of that, unfortunately, are that you either, if you're going to engage with people who are sexual, you have a lot of problem solving and work to do, or if you're going to narrow it down to other people who are also asexual, your pool is smaller, and it may be more difficult to find a partner or partners as a result of that. But there are ways to problem solve that are totally doable. But what I think this is what you're alluding to, and I apologize if I'm just repeating what you said, but it's sort of in my head, is like, we tend to be biased in the direction of how do we figure out how to get the asexual person to engage sexually, as opposed to how do we respect that this person's boundaries around sex are completely legitimate. And I think therapists need to be mindful of that as well, because therapists also will pathologize asexuality because of how poorly it's talked about in school and stuff. So we never talked about asexuality until, like, I think like one class in our doctoral program is like all I can recall ever talking about asexuality. We never talked about it when I was in. We had a whole class about sex therapy, but we never talked about navigating asexual relationships or asexuality.
I don't think I fully engaged asexuality as a concept until I was training to be a therapist. Like, it wasn't something that came up often enough in my life before where my brain decided this is something that I need to learn more about, or like I never had friends who told me that is how they chose to identify or anything like that. Like, it just wasn't there. And I think a lot of the reason why is because it's really, really hard to say that you are asexual in our society, because you just get met with all of this shit. Like, I feel like I've had conversations with people where it's just like, you say conversion therapy to someone, hits an alarm, you're like, conversion therapy is bad, terrible, awful. But then in that, that same person maybe down the line could hear about asexuality and they're just like, oh, I don't see how anybody could not want sex. And it's like,
dude, yeah.
do you see kind of where we are here? Like, you kind of got to let people be who they are.
Yep.
Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's bad, kind of thing. So yeah. I think I don't
understand how somebody could root for Arsenal, but I respect it.
You are really trying me here later in the night, huh, buddy? We're gonna go to this next question here. How might I explain to friends/family that being demisexual does not mean that I am interested in each of my friends or only ever want to date my friends?
Okay, so these types of questions always interest me because I get them a lot. And I'm talking about the format of the question, not the content of it. Because whoever asked this question sounds like they know perfectly well how to explain it. It sounds like the issue is that the people around them aren't internalizing and hearing it and synthesizing it properly.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not totally your cross to bear, person who asked this question. It can be immensely frustrating. I'm not trying to invalidate that. Trying to talk to friends or family or whomever who don't understand the way certain sexualities or identities or whatever work can be immensely frustrating because you're always in this educational role, and that can be exhausting. At the same time, people have to be willing to listen, ask curiosity-based questions about what you're describing to them, show that they're interested in learning more about it, and do the work to learn more about it. And ultimately, if those folks are not able to do that or willing to do that, it's not about ability, it's more about willingness. If people aren't willing to do that, then it's on you to determine what kind of boundaries you want to have with your family around what you disclose, how you disclose it, and what you do about it. So these questions are always interesting because it's always more about how can I get the system around me to do something differently, as opposed to this probably isn't this person not knowing how to disclose this stuff, because the question in and of itself suggests you know exactly how to describe your experience. People just aren't listening. And that's something that you have to decide what you want to do with it. Some folks will go in the direction of accepting that, you know what, they're just never going to get it, and these relationships are meaningful to me, and I can allow that to be what it is. There are other people that will fight tooth and nail to have their perspective heard amidst people not being willing to do it. And there are other folks who say, you know what, this is not a part of my life I'm going to engage with around these people, or they cut them off entirely. And I don't think any of those is better or worse than the other, because ultimately people have to be willing to reciprocate the work that you put in. Communication is a two-way street. I could deliver the most clear answer to a question, and if a person has no interest in hearing what I have to say or doesn't actively listen to it, there's nothing I can do about that. I can certainly adjust my messaging if a person is willing to disclose that they don't follow what I'm saying, that they're confused about it, that they want to know more. That's fine. But there is also a difference between curiosity and asking questions to be antagonistic about a person's experience. And I think that that's another area of boundary, that like if people are asking questions to be devil's advocate on your experience, that's not healthy. If people are asking like, well, what does demisexual mean to you? I don't really fully understand what this is. Can you explain how it plays out in your life? That's cool because people are trying to learn more. And I think it's okay to be patient with folks like that. But if people aren't showing a willingness to engage with you and learn more and be curious about it, then you have to decide what boundaries you want to implement as a result. And those can be painful boundaries to set, but they are also very important.
Yeah, I think it's a boundaries question, honestly.
It is.
Because I think you made a really, really good point about you could give them what could be considered the Bible on what demisexuality is, or demisexuality. I don't know why I said demi. It's probably just getting late. Demisexuality is. And if they choose not to engage with it, then you've done what you can do. And then you have to realize if you want to continue to try and explain it, or if, you set a boundary like this is just something that this person is not interested in, not going to understand. There's a difference between, you can have the same statement and they mean two totally different things. You can have, I don't understand mean, I don't understand, but I want to, and I don't understand, I can't engage.
So shut the hell up. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you kind of have to figure out and parse which one of those it is. And if that leads to a boundary of you saying, I'm tired of explaining this and I don't want to anymore, or because you don't want to understand, this is a relationship that I kind of have to either pull back from or just completely disengage altogether, that's fine. Even if it's with family. We haven't really gotten to this point yet, but Ryan and I are definitely not anti-family cutoff.
Nope.
Sometimes
pro cutoff.
Yep. Yeah.
Totally pro cutoff.
Don't really care what the familial relationship is. If it's a bad, in your determination, a bad relationship that you think you need to cut off from,
get out.
Go for it.
Nobody is owed your engagement.
Except for, parents and minor children. You can't just cut
Except
off
parents and minor children. Your minor children are entitled to you as a parent. That's the only dynamic where a person is entitled to you.